afternoon. It's great to see you. So many of you in the middle of exam week at the Ed School. This is great. My name is Fernando Reimers. I'm a faculty member here, and I have the privilege of chairing this discussion that we're going to have today. This Askwith Forum is run in conjunction with a conference of the Global Education Innovation Initiative that is taking place today and tomorrow. And the forum, as well as the conference, are focusing on the question of what does it mean to educate students for a diverse and rapidly changing world. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists, who include Maureen Costello, Roger Brooks, Stephanie Jones, and our Dean, Jim Ryan. Before I introduce them, I want to highlight that tonight is the last Askwith Forum of the year. And it's been held in conjunction, as I mentioned, with our conference. This year we welcome almost 4,000 people on campus for this forum and debates. And we're pleased that you're joining us this evening, both here and also in the live stream. So, public schools are essential to the functioning of a democratic society and to prepare people for a world that, if there is one thing we know about it, is that it's going to change and continue to change exponentially. So the question of what should we teach and how is one that educators must constantly ask themselves. Our panel tonight is going to address that question in the context of the United States. And I'm going to ask each one of them, after I introduce them briefly to you, to share their views on what is it that our schools should be teaching and what are some of the challenges of helping students develop those capabilities as we think about the demands of participating, accessing jobs, creating jobs, or engaging in life in a democratic society. So to my left is Maureen Costello, who leads the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance Project, which is one of the nation's leading providers of anti-bias education resources. And she oversees all aspects of that project. Before joining the Southern Poverty Law Center, she oversaw the development of the 2010 Census in Schools program for Scholastic Inc. in partnership with the Census Bureau. She also directed Newsweek's education program dedicated to engaging high school students, and she served as academic dean at Notre Dame High School in Staten Island, New York. She's a graduate of the New School University and the New York University Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. To her left is Roger Brooks, who's the president and CEO of Facing History and Ourselves, an organization created by one of our graduates, Margot Strum. The organization's mission is to engage students of diverse backgrounds in an examination of racism, prejudice, and anti-Semitism in order to promote the development of a more humane and informed citizenry. He has a long-standing commitment to Holocaust education through his affiliation with the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern University, which provides professional development to college educators who teach about and study the Holocaust. He's the author of 6 books and numerous articles, including several volumes of translation and commentary on foundational Jewish texts. He joined Facing History following a tenure at Connecticut College, where in addition to serving as Dean of the Faculty and Chief Academic Officers, he also held the Elie Wiesel Professorship in the Department of Religious Studies for 23 years. Stephanie Jones, to his left, is a colleague. She's the Maria and Max Kargman Associate Professor in Human Development and Urban Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her research, anchored in prevention science, focuses on the effects of poverty and exposure to violence on children and youth's social, emotional, and behavioral development. Over the last decade, her work has focused on both evaluation research addressing the impact of preschool and elementary-focused social and emotional learning interventions on behavioral and academic outcomes and classroom practices, as well as new curriculum development, implementation, and testing. She is the recipient of the Gromeyer Award in Education for her work with Ziegler and Walter Gilliam on a vision for universal preschool education, and a recipient of the Joseph Zien's Early Career Distinguished Contribution Award for action research in social and emotional learning. To her left is our Dean, Jim Ryan, who's the Charles William Eliot Professor of Education and the 11th Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dean Ryan is a leading expert on law and education and has written extensively about the ways in which law structures educational opportunity. His scholarly work addresses such topics as school desegregation, school finance, school choice, standards and testing, pre-K, and the intersection of special education and neuroscience. He's author of the textbook Educational Policy and the Law, and the author of 5 Miles Away, A World Apart. And in addition, he has authored articles on constitutional law and theory, and has argued before the United States Supreme Court. He's also the author of a recent book, which was based on his widely acclaimed graduation speech last year, and which is a bestseller. It's a book on what are the essential questions that could help us have fruitful conversations. It's not in your bio that I was given, Jim. I will give that book as a graduation present for my son this year. So, before coming to Harvard, he was a Matheson and Morgenthau Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. He also served as Academic Associate Dean and founded and directed the school's program in Law and Public Service. So, please join me in giving our panelists a warm welcome. So why don't we begin with you, Maureen? What's your take on this question of what are some of the things we should teach in light of changes in American society, and what are the challenges to doing that?
Well, I think we have an enormous number of challenges, and before I get quite to that question, let me give you a sense of how teaching tolerance has grown to address the current context. We were started in 1991 with a mission mainly to reduce prejudice among our nation's school children. And of course, in 1991, we had just completed 20 years of increasing school integration. What we did not know in 1991 was that school integration had peaked in 1989. And so what's happened then over the next 15 or 20 years was that not only did schools become more segregated, but we also began to see a concentration or change, let's say, in the demographics of the students who were going to our schools, and also increasing evidence of inequity in our schools, whether in discipline, in academic opportunity, and in other ways. And so we changed our mission to include that we were supporting equitable experiences for our nation's school children. And we work primarily through educators to kind of provide practical advice to teachers, administrators, and counselors. Today, 25 or 26 years into our mission, we are modifying it yet again, and what we think about now is how do we educate for a diverse democracy, which I think fits very well into the notion of 21st century skills. The kinds of things that we think are necessary to educate for a diverse democracy, first of all, involves thriving in diversity, being comfortable with difference. Something that American schools are not necessarily putting at the forefront of their programming all the time, and yet we believe very deeply that they should. It also means being able to have the skills and habits of mind and heart that go along with having agency in a democracy, being a critical thinker, both a producer and a consumer of information, and being able to weigh decisions and make decisions, but also being able to do, as you're a student, to do things. We often call it just do something, but it's basically have projects and have real authentic work that affects change in communities. So those are some of the big things that we look at, and in fact, we've published something called the Social Justice Standards, which are grade-based outcomes that look at 4 domains that we think are essential: identity, diversity, justice, and action. And we think that every student should have an opportunity to fully explore all 4 of those domains and come out of school with a sense that they are active citizens of their community, of their school, of their neighborhood, but eventually of the nation and of the world, who have a responsibility to make a positive, to leave a positive footprint, in a sense, behind. We are concerned, however, today, because we know that that is particularly difficult in the United States, particularly in the historic moment that we're in. And part of it is because so much education takes place outside of the classroom. I'm going to give you an example of our education system failing. There's a young man who quit high school after his freshman year. And he wandered about, he had odd jobs, he didn't seem to have a purpose in life. And then at the time of the Trayvon Martin killing, he talked to people and could not understand. He tended to side with the shooter, and he couldn't understand what the big issue was. And somebody said to him, well, you know, it's justified because there's a whole epidemic of black on white crime in this country that nobody is paying attention to. And this young man decided that he would look into it himself. And so he went to Google and he typed in black on white crime. And the first page of results were basically all sites that told him that yes, there was a huge problem with black on white crime. These sites were sites like Stormfront, the Daily Stormer, AMREM, which is called American Renaissance. And this young man, whose name was Dylan Roof, took this information and he killed people in the church in Charleston. And it concerns me because it's not simply a failure of our education system, but it also tells me that education is not simply happening in schools, and that it is not simply happening and being directed by educators. Google was founded with the motto, do no evil. And the founders of Google invented that site, and I believe they are, after all, no, I'm sorry, I was thinking of Facebook. The founders of Google developed that site as a neutral platform for all the information of the world. And I'm sure that they thought that it would in fact be a free marketplace of ideas. And what has happened is that it has been gamed by people who have figured out the algorithm, have figured out how to make their postings come to the top. And I think what it says to me is that we have a much larger task in front of us, which is not simply to make sure that in schools we are teaching about identity and diversity and justice and action, but to make sure that we're also convincing some of these other sectors in American society which are influencing young people and are the sources of so much of their information, that they too have an obligation to defend what is dear to us, which is some of the fundamental values of democracy.
Thank you, Maureen. Roger.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I want to tell you a story about the first school I visited when I became president of Facing History just a little bit more than 2 years ago. It's a public performing arts school, and it's a very interesting populace. 98% of the students are African American. In other words, it's a product of American resegregation of education. This is a big issue that is on the table. We need to talk about it. We keep saying we need to talk about it, and then we don't talk about it. So, what happened? I'm the principal of this school believed that it was really important for every student in the school in 10th grade to have a full year of Facing History in ourselves. Normally, students, a full implementation is a 4 to 6 week segment. We wrote a curriculum with them. They do a full year. And I went into one of the 10th grade classes, and the day I was there, they happened to be studying the Holocaust and Kristallnacht, the first pogrom that started the Holocaust. And I walked in and they were doing a pair and share exercise. They had a text and they were reading it together and asking questions back and forth. So I walked over to one table and there were 2 young men there. And I just listened to them while they were talking. And as they're reading, one young man said to the other, I had no idea that after Kristallnacht, all the Jews in Germany lost their jobs. And the teacher walked over at exactly the right moment, leaned in between the 2 students, kind of put one hand on each of their shoulders and said, or asked, who do you think took the jobs? And then she walked away. And it took, it seemed like it was several minutes, but it was probably 12 seconds before the dime dropped or the nickel dropped or whatever it was. And the 2 of them realized at that moment that there was something much more going on here than anti-Semitism. There was anti-Semitism layered on top of economics, layered on top of politics, layer upon layer upon layer. And they were therefore able to begin to peel away the layers of what they saw. Well, the really important moment from the point of view of facing history in that story is not that occurrence. What's really important is that those students later in the year at some point are going to turn to the end ourselves part of facing history. And what they're going to look at is their school. And they're going to realize that the reason their school has been resegregated is much more complicated than it just looks like. There were choices that people made, real life choices, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, that resulted in the way things are. Just link real estate taxes to educational funding, and you end up with this model, right? Okay, so that's an introduction to what facing history is like. What I like about that story is there are all three of the big pieces of facing history are there. The first is we think it's really important to start with students' own identities, where they are, who they are. We think it's really important to give them a very deep case study in history, whether it's the Holocaust or the Reconstruction in America or the Civil Rights struggle, the Armenian genocide. We have many case studies, but we want the students deeply into that history in a non-reductive way. And then we want to have them analyze the choices that were available at the time and the choices that were made so that they can think about one of our great taglines, people make choices, choices make history. We want them to think about the choices they're going to make as shaping the history their children are going to live out. So that's a little bit about who and what facing history is. We have many of the same kinds of goals that Teaching Tolerance does. We're sometimes rivals, but we're rivals that are siblings. We're very close.
Oh, it's cousins.
Cousins. Yeah, okay. I was willing to be your sibling, but okay. I want to, before I yield, I just want to give two examples of challenges that I think are really before us right now. The first is that if you want to do deep work on something, depth of study on history, depth of study on social emotional learning, etc., you cannot help, you simply cannot help but run into the issues of those that say you got to do more, you got to cover more breadth, coverage models, and we run into that all the time. It's actually a bigger problem than you might think. And the second challenge is if you teach closely associated with students' experiences, by definition, people are going to think you're political. And it's not political to say, here's who you are, here's what the world you're living in. That's reality. But it's easily taken as political. Okay, so that said, I want to just give a couple of competencies that I think are really important for us to develop. The first is helping students broaden their universe of obligation. So universe of obligation, right, the group of people you feel like you care about, usually starts with our family. One of the things that Facing History spends a lot of time on from the very beginning is helping students map their identity in ways that let them break down the distinction between us and them, that start to make them see, I've got commonality with the kid across the room and maybe the kid across the 5 miles that are forever, right? That's first. The second is we really want students in the 21st century to have a real strong disposition towards civic engagement. So you got to layer that on top of civic literacy, but then engagement. And engagement can take lots of forms. It can be voting. It can be, joining a club or something. But we want students to feel like they want to participate in civic life. A third big thing is that we want students arguing about history, but not arguing or arguing using history, right? Using history to argue. I don't really want them arguing about what happened. I don't want to introduce the world of fake facts and fake news. But I do want them to learn how to marshal evidence from history for arguments. And maybe last, but certainly not least, we want students to develop the ability to disagree in ways that produce good conversation. This is really hard, but we want students to be able to say, I disagree with you, but that doesn't mean that we have to have fracture or discord or dislike of one another, right? I have a different opinion about something than you do. That's what we're trying to build at Facing History, and happy to talk with you about it more.
Thank you,
Okay,
Roger.
you're it.
Stephanie.
I'm it. So I think you two might be siblings. I'm trying to figure out what I am then. Maybe you can be the judge when I describe what I do. So I'm a developmental psychologist, and I'm a researcher, and I study social, emotional, and behavioral development from very early childhood through adolescence. And most of my work lately is concerned with trying to define exactly what we mean by those things and what they look like in children's behavior in different contexts. So that's one thing. The other thing is evaluating, but also designing and testing interventions, largely interventions that get implemented in preschools or elementary schools, but some of our work extends into the higher grades. And so I think I'm going to speak as a researcher primarily, but we've done some work distilling common denominator practices from effective SEL programs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what those are. So, but I'm going to start with how we define the competencies, and I think that when designing interventions or when evaluating interventions, we're obligated to be super precise and clear about what it is we expect children to be able to do on the one hand, and how those things develop over time, but also are sensitive to different contexts. So where are children able to develop certain kinds of skills, practice them, fail, practice again, and where are they not able to do those things? So that's my overview. I think in the end I am a distant cousin, maybe? Okay, so the first thing is, from research, there's a great deal of evidence about the power of this domain generally. There are two studies in particular that came out over the last 5 years that show that children's self-control and their social competence, measured when they're in preschool, 4 years old, 5 years old, are related to life outcomes, so earnings, physical health, mental health, 20 years later, even after accounting for all sorts of intervening things that we worry about. So, and that's pretty powerful stuff. So we know from research that this body of skills is super important. We also know that children who face stress, trauma, and vulnerability suffer the most. They really struggle the most in this area. And there's a whole new science of the brain that's focused on executive function and self-regulation that links stress to brain function to behavior, and may be one of the core mechanisms that underlie the relationship between stress and behavior, and could be an opportunity for thinking about what to do. So that said, what are the skills obsessively? What do we really want kids to be able to do that may be a foundation for open-mindedness, for how to take another's perspective and argue and disagree productively? And we define those specific skills in 3 areas. A set of cognitive skills. So when we talk about social emotional learning or social and emotional development, we often leave off the core cognitive skills. And those include things like being able to handle impulses, to be able to maintain and focus and shift attention. These are often referred to as things like executive function, but also we hear them referred to as things like grit, perseverance, self-discipline. The second area are a core set of emotion-related skills, like having a rich emotions vocabulary, being able to regulate and manage emotions in oneself, but also to observe them and understand them in another, a key feature of empathy and perspective taking, but a basic foundational building block. And then a set of interpersonal skills like cooperating, taking others' perspectives, reading social cues, and so on. This is sort of the social domain. The thing that's often forgotten in this whole world is that it's not enough to have the skill. I can have the skill, but never use it, or not feel safe to use it. So there's a whole other domain that we sometimes call orientations or facilitating factors, which have to do with some set of internal guideposts, or guideposts in the context, norms, that get kids and adults, I would say, to use those skills when it matters. And that's not something that the world of social emotional development, social emotional learning, has really been very careful with and thought about a great deal. But it's really important, necessary, and I think it is the link between all of us. So that's the broad array of competencies that we tend to talk about. There are a couple of other big points about them that are important to remember. One is that they're all interrelated. So they're not distinct, separate things all the time, but they get taught in that way. The other is that they're developmental. Some are more important than others at different times, which means that we can be more precise, I think, than we typically are in how we build and implement interventions. The third is that they're super sensitive to context. So it's not the case that children will learn, acquire, feel comfortable practicing a set of emotion-related skills if the adults around them are emotionally muted or emotionally aggressive, right? So no kid will acquire those skills with modeling that isn't consistent with them. It's also hard to acquire and practice those skills in contexts that are unsafe and don't provide opportunities to practice. I guess the third part about context that is really important is that it's now bleeding into the intervention part, which is that emotions, for example, or social skills, social interactions, or even using and focusing your attention doesn't happen only in a 30-minute block once a week, right? So it happens all the time. And most of the interventions that we develop and implement are isolated to these tiny little blocks that don't actually map onto the reality of human behavior. So that is the segue to interventions. And now I'm going to make a pitch. You weren't going to talk about your book, and you didn't bring it, but I brought some things. And I'm not selling them, but they're all opportunities. So in terms of what works to build these skills, there are lots of interventions and curricula developed for schools, and lots of them have been tested. I would describe them, I think, in the ways that you kind of described them, which they're comprehensive, and they're heavy, and they take time, investment, and effort, which is not a bad thing. It's not always a possible thing. We have recently completed a kind of compendium or guide of sorts for 25 of these programs for elementary school and out-of-school time. It's free on the Wallace Foundation website. I happen to bring a copy that I'm not going to hand around, but I'm going to show you. This is why I brought my bag in. It's not short, but it has a lot of interesting and very useful information at the front about the domain, and then it has a profile for each program that describes in obsessive detail what the program covers and how it does it. And it's free, and you can download it and only read parts of it. The second is an issue of a journal called The Future of Children that is being released May 31st. And this is more of a distillation of the evidence of effectiveness for different kinds of approaches at different stages of development. So preschool, elementary school, middle childhood and high school, out of school time, teacher training, all that kind of stuff. And so this is also free, but not available until May 31st. So there's lots of stuff out there that works. The question is, what's common across all of that stuff that works that one could fool with outside of doing a whole curriculum? And I would say that it boils down, having read obsessively all the curricular materials for 25 programs, it boils down to four things. Four things make for effective programs. The first is modeling, having adults and even peers who model and live the skills that we are trying to build. Right? So it doesn't happen without adults who are it and show kids how to do it in their everyday interactions. The second is teach. So we don't often think that we might have to teach children how to pay attention in the way we want them to, or what the word respect means. Something we say, I've said this to my children 1,000 times, pay attention. Child looks up. And you can tell they're confused. They're not totally sure what you mean by that. What could I do to show you I'm paying attention, right? So there's some direct instructional part. Practice, the third one. Opportunities to practice and fail. All of this stuff happens in everyday moments and interactions. Children need opportunities to practice, and for adults to give them the space to do it. Discuss is the fourth. The skills, identity, justice, diversity, they are part of the discourse in the place. So there's discussions. It's in the language of interactions between adults and kids, between kids, and so on. So those are the four, I would say, common denominators. I think if we really are interested in scale for this kind of work, we have to think about core practices. Sometimes we call them common denominators, sometimes we call them kernels of practice that are short, easier to do, highly relevant, and selectable, right? So that the person who knows the classroom, who knows the school, who's doing the work, can say, oh, what I really need, I'm sensing, is this kind of thing, and I'm going to pull this off and try it. So I think that I think we're all thinking in similar ways. That's the kind of thing that we want to try now and test in the world. There are a whole bunch of challenges. I'm going to name 3 and not talk about them because we want to move to Jim.
You can talk about that.
The first is this issue of the lexicon. So I don't know if you've noticed, but we've all talked about the same big domain, but we've used different words to do it. The truth is that what underlies those words is a set of common definitions and understandings, but the challenge of talking about them in different ways means we're not always talking in the same way, even though we think we might be. So the field is rife with words. Some of them are the same, some are different, sometimes they mean the same thing, sometimes they are the same but they mean different things. And in order to be really effective with interventions, we need to all be talking about the same thing and know that we are. So that's one big challenge, I think. And our group is very interested in working on this. The second is the quick fix, the gimmick. There's a lot of stuff out there that is being peddled as the answer to troubling behavior, or the way to build children's executive functions, or their memory, or their attention, or their social skills. And not a lot of it, truthfully, has evidence. And not a lot of it is built based on evidence, or with human development in mind, or context for that matter. So beware the quick fix, because the work is not quick. Right? The truth is it takes a lot of effort, it takes time, and it takes being willing to fail and try again. Right? So that it's not easy. And the last thing is the adult. So I said one of the 4 common denominators is modeling. Most of the SEL curricula or programs don't take seriously the need to really support and build adult skills as a core part of the work. And it's not just training adults to be, emotionally regulated, because none of us are emotionally regulated all the time. But supporting adults to manage the stressors of teaching and the larger context, right? So the supporting adults in their needs that then translates into their actions on behalf of the kids. And that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Jim?
So Fernando, thanks for inviting me. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you. I want to just amend Stephanie's biography with one key fact, which is an update. On the one hand, I'm sorry to say she is no longer an associate professor, but I'm delighted to say that she is now a recently tenured professor. So continuing the theme of trying to identify the relationship among all of us on the stage, I couldn't help but thinking one of these things is not like the other, and that would be me. I am a lawyer by training and was a law professor before I became dean, and as Fernando was saying, spent a fair bit of time studying the way that law structures educational opportunity. And in my very brief remarks, I want to step back and widen the scope a little bit. And basically make the point that if we really care about educating students for an increasingly diverse world, that's difficult to do if we continue to educate kids in segregated settings. That's a simple point. It's not impossible, but that is not the best strategy if you want to prepare students for a diverse world. So start with, why would we care? Why would we want a competency or a goal of education to prepare students to live peacefully and productively and work peacefully and productively in a diverse world? There are a few reasons. One, we are becoming an increasingly diverse society here and abroad. In the US, the majority of students now are students of color. If we want students to thrive as individuals, they need to be comfortable in diverse settings. If they're not comfortable in diverse settings, they may bypass opportunities that would exist if they were more comfortable. If they're leading organizations, they may miss out on what we know to be true, which is that diverse organizations are stronger than homogeneous ones. So if you just think about the level of the individual, if a student is not comfortable in a diverse world, he or she is less likely to thrive, regardless of the student's own background. In terms of societal benefits, I think Thurgood Marshall put it best back in 1974. This was in a case, Milliken versus Bradley. Thurgood Marshall had argued Brown versus Board of Education successfully. And Milliken versus Bradley, I won't go into the details, was basically a pullback from Brown versus Board of Education and made it really difficult to integrate across school district lines, which meant that it would be really difficult to integrate between cities and suburbs. It was the beginning of the end of Brown, to a certain extent, a beginning of the end of integration, which had really only started in earnest a few years before. And Justice Marshall wrote in dissent, this was 1974, so this is the 20th anniversary of Brown, and it's a really poignant moment. And he wrote, unless our children begin to learn together, our people will never learn to live together. And I think we have seen the proof of that prophecy. It's no secret that our country is divided in some ways more than we've ever seen in the last 25 years, divided along lines of race, along lines of class, along lines of religion. This is both cause and effect of the segregation that we see in our schools. If we want to have a segregated society, we should continue to have segregated schools. It's as simple as that. So why is it difficult to teach students and prepare students for a diverse society in segregated schools? It's not impossible. You can teach about students from different groups and those who are in the school and exposed to different cultures. But what you miss out on are the opportunities for students to learn from one another, to recognize that although there are differences along obvious lines, oftentimes those differences just mask much more in common. So that one of the points of bringing students from diverse backgrounds together is they realize just how much they have in common, as well as what's different about them. And this is not lost on university communities. One of the real ironies to me is, if you look at elite universities, they all point to diversity as absolutely critical to their missions as educational institutions. They recognize the importance of bringing a diverse student body together. And yet we don't really have the same conversation when it comes to the K-12 system. And instead, what we see in the K-12 system, and Roger was talking about this earlier, is that our schools are more segregated today than they were a quarter century ago. By some measures, racial segregation is higher. It certainly hasn't been decreasing. And economic segregation has increased fairly dramatically. We are becoming more separate in many ways rather than less. And if you really care about preparing students for a diverse world, this should really be of major concern to you. The challenge is, of course, and part of the reason I think this is not so much a part of the conversation, I mean, some of it is that the whole topic of integration has become politicized and of diversity has become politicized. But part of the challenge is that it seems like a very difficult challenge to address, and it is. Like I said, current segregation levels are cause and effect of school segregation. And by that I mean we have a great deal of residential segregation, which has been fueled in part by school segregation, which in turn reinforces school segregation. That is a very difficult challenge to meet. In addition, courts, especially federal courts, are not only no longer really in the business of pushing for integration, but they've made it difficult, more difficult, to voluntarily integrate on the basis of race, which takes away some potentially effective tools and leaves us with a really daunting challenge. And let me just give some suggestions about how to approach the challenge. One is that we need to change the conversation a bit about what we expect from schools and what the purpose of education is, and bring this idea of preparing students for a diverse world front and center into the conversation. That is, we need to be talking about the benefits of diversity to all students, not just a subgroup of students, but to all students. In the same way that we have the conversation about the benefits of diversity in higher education. If you look at any institution of higher education, they will tout the benefits of diversity. But there's no reason why we should wait until a subset of students who are in K-12 go to college before they get to realize the benefits of diversity. The second is we need to become more creative about approaches. We need to create opportunities for diverse schools, highlight examples of success, and then replicate them. This is happening already in countries, in districts across the country that have various forms of controlled choice plans that break the link between residents and school. It's happening in intentionally diverse charter schools. I just read about an effort to create a chain of private schools that are going to be intentionally diverse, and this is their mission. And in some respects, I think that we need to unleash the energy of social entrepreneurship onto this problem. But at the end of the day, we all need to make a choice in terms of whether we think that this is something that we ought to address or not. And until we get serious about addressing it, it's going to be an issue that we think of as inevitable and something that we need to work around rather than to confront. And just like Thurgood Marshall said in 1974, in dissenting in Millikan, that may seem like the easier course to take, but it's one that I think we'll regret.
Thank you, Jim. So thank you to the four of you. I'd like to give you each an opportunity to reflect on what you've heard others say and discover whether you're in fact first cousins or siblings, and see if we can begin to shape the common vocabulary that Stephanie is talking about as necessary. Because in listening to all of you, it seems to me that there are challenges, easy and hard, in what you have described. I don't think there is much that is controversial about the goals that you've all articulated in a democratic society, or at least there shouldn't be. And yet you're saying this work is becoming a bit more contested in some communities. And so I guess the question is, why should it be contested? Why should it be a matter for discussion that our schools should be preparing kids to function in a diverse society, to develop the socio-emotional competencies that you're talking about, and so on. So there are aspects of the challenges you have described which I see as easier than others. For example, the challenge of developing the common vocabulary. I can see how the effort that you're doing to catalog what works, identify good practices, building taxonomies would do that. It sounds like a very good book. I may give that to my son too for graduation. So there is those kinds of challenges. Then there are the harder challenges of activating the will. And I think those are challenges you're talking about, is how do we get a society to decide to do that which seems to be within reach. It's not that we don't know how to do these things. It's, if I hear you correctly, that we don't have the collective will to do it. So how are we going to activate that? How are we going to produce it? So maybe you all can reflect a little bit on what is it that this audience or others could do. What are 2 or 3 concrete things we could do to address both the easier and the less easy challenges, but also reflect on what you've heard before we invite the audience to come into this conversation.
Well, what I've heard, of course, is a remarkable degree of agreement. We may not have a common lexicon, but certainly everything that every other panelist has said is something that echoes with me and reinforces much of what our thinking around the issues in schools and also the approaches. I was rereading the new book that you are about to bring out, and you talked about the 3 kinds of going to scale. And the third one, which you said is the kind of the one that you regard as relevancy enhancing change, is trickier because it's regarding emerging notions of what competencies matter, but not widespread agreement on goals or practices. The problem is that we agree, but in fact, these are not totally accepted in the particular political moment that we are in.
Say more about that. What do you mean?
I would be happy to. In the last, over the course of the last year, I've had the opportunity to read stories and comments from about 14,000 teachers who responded to surveys that we conducted. The first one was in March during the primary season, and we basically asked, what is the impact of the presidential election on your students? We asked in a number of ways, and we gave lots of opportunities for open-ended answers. And so I got 2,000 responses, and among them, over 6,000 comments that we looked through, and it drew a very stark picture that, first of all, a quarter of the students in our nation's schools now are children of immigrant families, whether they are immigrants themselves or their parents are immigrants or somebody. And those children are traumatized. They were terrified. And this is what we found out even in March, just by the kind of rhetoric that was going around. Teachers also described a decrease in civility in schools. Now, it's a kind of charming way to put it, but that basically the kind of rhetoric, tone, and really coarseness of the political discourse that was happening in the campaign had filtered right down to the schools. And we're not talking just at middle school, although it did seem, one teacher said, this is a campaign that seems perfect for a 13-year-old boy. I apologize to everyone who was a 13-year-old boy, but I think we all know what they're talking about. We were hearing it in kindergarten classes, that children would say things that they had heard at home, would go to a fellow student and say, we're going to build a wall and you're not included. This was in March 2016. And 42% of teachers told us that they were hesitant to teach about the election at all. And that deeply worried me because we don't do civics very well in this country, but one of the opportunities to learn how to be a citizen happens every 4 years. Because every 4 years, teachers could be relied upon to make a big deal out of presidential elections. Elementary school teachers, festoon their classrooms with red, white, and blue, and they have mock elections, and they do all sorts of things, and figure the average student is going to live through 4 of these before they graduate from high school and then actually vote. And now we have a situation where 42% of American teachers were saying they were not going to talk about the election. Fast forward to November, and the election, and we had planned to do a post-election survey anyway. It became kind of more intensely needed given the results of the election. And a week after the election, we put out another survey, and this time got about 12,000 responses. And what it drew a picture of is trauma that I would say is shared by both students and teachers. And the part that I want to talk about is the teachers. Now we ask the same question. Are you hesitant about teaching about the election or post-election issues? It ticked up to 46%. And story after story told us about teachers who now felt that they could not endorse the kinds of goals that we're talking about: respect for diversity, being fair, making room in the school to respect everybody. That it was harder to even take an anti-bullying stance if the bullying was directed at somebody because of their religion or their immigration status, because now that was defended as free speech. What most teachers were afraid of, and they talked a lot about trying to figure out how to teach their values, the kind of values that we elite, coastal progressives think of as democratic values, that they feared that because they feared hearing from parents and parents complaining, and many of them had examples of parents complaining. Since we did that survey, we've also heard examples of teachers, schools, and districts being targeted by right-wing social media communities for doing something like sponsoring a Black Lives Matter seminar. The word gets out there, and through right-wing hate sites, people get told, here's the phone number to call. Here's the email address. So there is a chilling effect, and it is driven by people who don't share these goals. And their voice is probably larger than it should be. But teachers are already feeling very embattled about a lot of issues. And the stress, and Stephanie, you talked about the stress that is shared by both the adults and the children in the school. The stress is really building for teachers. And for many of them, the way out of it is just focus on the basics. And that is not going to help us educate for a diverse world or a diverse democracy, particularly given the fact that what this country will look like in 25 years or 30 years, the Census Bureau has projected that we will be a majority nation of color sometime around 2045. That nation already exists in our schools. And are we preparing them for the kind of leadership that we're going to demand from them in 30 years? So, that worries me, in that we share these values. But teachers work in local communities that are hostile to many of these values.
Stephanie.
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
I will regulate.
Okay, I will go in order. So I heard a number of things from my colleagues that I think resonate really strongly with me. One of them is the importance of paying attention to the research and making certain that what we're doing as interventions in the educational system are evidence-based. I can't tell you how important I think that is, that we not just throw out ideas that sound like they're good ideas. We have to test them. We have to make certain that we know what we're hoping to get out of them, what impact they're going to have, and then make certain that they're designed to get that impact, and that we can actually show that. These kinds of work, the work that I know we do, is just really important. The second thing that I heard that, again, just really resonates with me is the both importance of talking about and the difficulty of talking about issues of race. I raised them before, but they're right here. And I think part of the reason that's so complex is, in this country, it's how we live. We live divided by race and ethnicity, by sort of economic levels, but we live as a nation divided right now, and it's so the recent election was not the cause of these problems; it's the symptom, right? The election is a symptom, and it gives us an opportunity, if you like, to rip the protective cover off that used to be the civility we would never talk about these things, and gives us a moment to look sort of at the U.S. really deeply and in an unvarnished way. And some of my colleagues said, well, yeah, it's a ripping of the cover, let's put it back on. And I want to say, not so fast. Eventually, we'll put it back on. But I want us to look really deeply at what's there, have some conversations and some takeaway about it before we decide to cover it up and smooth it back over. And if there's a thing I would love to just urge all of my colleagues here in the whole room, it's not to let go of the issue, right? It's keep talking about it, and don't let the divisions in society. I say this to our students all the time. Don't let the divisions in society make divisions in your lives. Fight against that. So that's the second thing, and I'll stop there. I'll come back later. Your turn.
Now I'm not sure if I want to say what I was going to say. Oh, I'll just say it.
What the hell?
I don't think it's inconsistent. It's slightly different, which is, and I feel like maybe I'm the optimist in the group, which is that I actually think that we agree more than we disagree. And I think part of the reason for that is that we're not all...
Do you mean in this panel or in the country?
We definitely agree on the panel.
Yeah.
Although I was going to make a joke about Jim, but I'm not going to make it.
Now that you're tenured, you can disagree.
I can make jokes, right. I can do anything I want. But I think that our modes of discourse sometimes interrupt what I think is fundamental agreement. So one example, I was at a meeting a couple of years ago, so before the election, but not before the election started, so 2 years ago or 3 years ago, at the National Governors Association. And the topic of the meeting was, how do we make a case, build public will around integrating social emotional work into the practice of schools and schooling? Not have it be a program, but have it be woven in some fashion. And there was a lot of, the same kinds of conversation right now we were having then. And the director of the education division, I can't remember his name, I don't think he's there anymore. At one point during the meeting, he said, look, the emotion stuff isn't going to work in the southern states. Done. Like, that's it. You're not going to be able to get anywhere if you talk that way. The truth is that the language of emotions that might come from one tradition in our field is not that different from the values language that comes from maybe a different tradition and has great meaning to maybe people concentrated in different geographic places or even within places in different places. So, but the values conversation is, in my field, something that people have avoided because they're not comfortable with it, and it's not from their discipline. But it's not different. So I think that there's an opportunity here to get underneath the kinds of conversations that are stopping points or too hard to get past in the short term, and think about how to communicate strategically about what is common. Adults, parents, don't disagree that they want their children, it doesn't matter who they are, to be honest, to have integrity, right? To be stewards of their community, to hold and act on core values that I would say, these are the same things as being emotionally regulated or managing your emotions, right? You need all of these things together. So how we talk about them could be a way to build common ground, and developing a strategic communications approach that goes underneath some of the stopping points could be a way to build public will or communicate differently.
So the only thing that I would add that I think is a common thread throughout this is that I think that this is a time where we really need, and there's a real opportunity for creative and courageous leadership. So creative leadership in the way that Stephanie was talking about, which is figuring out the right way to talk about common interests and common values in a language that would resonate. And to Maureen's point, for teachers who are worried about talking about what are objectively core democratic values out of fear of being labeled partisan, they need a leader in their school to remind them that is absolutely proper and should be an obligation to talk about these, and if they need help in having the conversation, they should be offered help. But this is a moment in time, and then if you think about the larger issue of how do you promote diversity in schools when some of the most obvious tools are no longer on the table, you absolutely need both creativity and courage. Creativity to think about other means of doing it, and courage to be standing up and saying over and over again that I know this seems inevitable, but it isn't inevitable, and it's a real problem. I like to think that part of what we are trying to do here at the Ed School is prepare students to take those leadership roles because they are needed now more than ever.
Thanks, Jim. So that's a good segue into the second part of our conversation. We have 2 mics, one on each aisle of the room. If you would please queue behind the mics. We're going to take 3 questions. It'd be best if they're brief and end in a question mark, and then we'll give our panelists an opportunity to take them 3 at a time. Why don't we begin with you? Tell us who you are.
My name is Lisa Goldman. I'm an alum, and I've been a teacher and a management consultant. I wanted to make a couple of comments in terms of increasing the conversation about the nature of diversity. I think part of the problem we have in talking about diversity in this country is that our definition of diversity is too narrow. As someone who has taught, I think one of the things that we need to do in schools is teach children to appreciate every single individual for both that individual's unique characteristics and the characteristics that individual has in common with other people. And we don't really do that very well. That's one point I wanted to make. The second one is children learn prejudice from adults. Anybody who's ever dealt with young children knows that little kids don't see color, they don't know socioeconomics, they just don't pay any attention. An example I just want to say, my daughter came home from kindergarten one day, really upset. She had green eyes. And she was one of only 2 children in the classroom who had green eyes. And the kindergarten teacher had made a big deal about eye color that day. And she was completely freaked out. My first impulse was to say to her, we consider green eyes beautiful, you should feel good. And then I realized, no, this is a real opportunity. And I said to her, some people worry about your eye color, some people worry about your skin color, some people worry about what kind of clothes you wear. I said, but we're all special, and we all have things about us that are like other people, and it would be boring if we were all the same. Anyway, so I wanted to just make those points, and the one other piece I want to throw out is that segregation in this country is based on property tax. And the way to get rid of it, I think, is incredibly simple. Stop funding education, public education through property taxes.
Thank you, Lisa. Let's hear from Rafael. Tell us
I'm
who you
Rafael
are.
from Brazil. I feel honored to be here and to listen to you talking. I'm very lucky to be here. And I was eager to come here and participate in this conversation. I also was reminded of a book that I read during my PhD that's called The First R. That is actually how the first R that we learn in school and in life is racism. And also a story from Brazil, because all the research that we conduct there about racism, when you ask people if they are racist, then 90% of them say they aren't. But then when you ask, do you think that, people in Brazil are racist? Then they say, yes, everybody's racist. So nobody is racist, but everybody else is racist, right? And also at the same time, I was deeply shocked of, I think I myself and many people in this country and all over the world, by the result of the elections, not because of the person, but because of the symbolic reasons, because this country is has always been a huge leader defending democracy, freedom, individual rights, and so on and so forth. And I just feel like, well, I was shocked, and I feel like many people were shocked, and many of my friends here who work in schools were shocked and not knowing how to deal with that. And I feel like many people not only feel that we should be louder in talking about the problems that are happening right now, but that teachers need much more help in the schools than they are getting right now. The teachers feel, they have always felt very isolated and powerless, but they are feeling even more. This is just anecdotal. This is just me, talking to my friends who work here. But yeah, sorry. But my question is just, if you feel that we shouldn't be louder in talking about what's happening, and if you feel that you're doing enough to help teachers in the classrooms.
Thank you, Rafael. Let's take one more question before we give the panelists an opportunity to respond.
Jay Gleason. So why shouldn't we debate the history itself, whether you call it fake history or revisionist history? Take, for instance, facing history and facing ourselves. You usually avoid any case studies about Israel's appalling human rights and apartheid record. You usually avoid U.S. foreign policy. How history is presented or not presented is every bit as much an issue as whatever lessons we may learn and apply from it, too, isn't it?
All right. Let's give our panelists a chance to respond to any of these questions before we take another round.
I'd like to address the teacher isolation issue and the idea of be louder. I think we have to be louder, but in chorus. I think that the lone teacher, we're setting them up for a very difficult life. So what we've been advising schools, and I agree completely, you need that strong administration, but you need to build alliances and find those people who really do share the goal of what should be happening in schools and what is producing the best result for children. And many of those allies are the parents. And so one of the things that we've been suggesting is that schools, teachers, educators do more to engage families and engage parents. One of the best ways to prevent the angry parent is share beforehand what it is you're going to be teaching. Parents should be allies in the educational process. Secondly, establish norms of behavior that are democratically chosen. And this is a part of every teacher's toolkit that at the beginning of the year you kind of work with the class to establish some classroom rules. And some of those rules are about no name calling, no hurting someone's feelings, and that kind of very deliberate talking about what respect looks like and why everyone deserves to be heard. Sometimes you use things like a talking stick, or you do the community circles, but there are ways, in fact, to teach the behavior that will, in fact, then grow into that idea of respectful discourse. And most importantly, as we looked at, in the last survey we did, we asked teachers for both examples of harassment and misbehavior, but we also said, do you have signs of hope and inclusion? And while there were stories of wonderful responses, some of which were student-led, some of which were teacher-led, sometimes they were school-led, they were top-down, but what they all had in common was a supportive administration and that had created structures and expectations about people listening to each other, being responsive, and being supported in dialogue. And so those are the kinds of things that I would say to educators is don't be the lone voice. There's going to be at least one other person on your staff who feels the same way among your peers. And there's probably many more. Find them, speak in a chorus.
Stephanie?
I would just add to that to say, to consider jumping back a step and thinking about seeding the field from the beginning, which is how do we provide teachers in their pre-service training with the exposure, with the practice, with the information that gets driven into their classroom practice. There's no teacher training in behavior management that is required as part of any training program in the United States. Effective behavior management is a tool for building community and talking with kids about all of these issues. So we have to step a little bit back and say, what are the levers for getting this kind of skill, capacity, not to ignore what's happening now, but there are ways to weave it in so that teachers are better prepared to act on it right away.
So I love the question about sort of what to study and how to present the resources that came up at the very end. These are, I think, really foundational questions about history. And when I said that I'd love to see students using history and making good arguments, not debating it, what I mean is I don't want students to sort of fall into the world of fake news. So what we have done recently is to come out with some work on news literacy in the digital age. It's called Facing Ferguson, and it's about what happened in Ferguson and the first 2 weeks of media coverage. It's a curriculum that helps students think about media bias, but also the bias of the way things are, confirmation bias, implicit bias, the way things are presented to them in class. I think that's a fundamental issue, and it's one that we're taking up. So,
I mean, just to go back to the very first set of comments and the point about diversity, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we oftentimes reduce diversity to talking about race and socioeconomic status, in part because that's where the lines of segregation are so glaring. But I think the point is exactly right, that when we think about diversity, we should be thinking about it broadly, and educating students to be aware that there are numerous points of commonality and numerous points of difference that make us both have an awful lot in common and also unique. And one of the things that we started doing last year precisely in this vein was having a community-wide event called Double Take, and it's totally simple. 10 people, students, faculty, and staff, tell their story. And it is a story that is designed to make you think twice. And one of the big points behind it is, once you hear these 10 stories, you realize that you don't really know as much as you might think about the people who are around you in your community, and that hopefully inspires curiosity to learn more. And one response to the question of helping educators, one of the things that we did after the election, we have a website called Usable Knowledge, which is basically designed to translate the research done here into a usable format for those who are in the field, whether parents or principals or teachers or policymakers. And as a subset of that project, we started the One and All project, which is specifically designed to help educators who are dealing with issues of bullying or harassment or having difficult conversations, all of which were problems before the election, but were highlighted or exacerbated during the election. And the whole idea was to provide a resource for teachers in classrooms today and for school leaders. But baked into the process was an opportunity for teachers and parents and principals to share their stories and their strategies, so that it wasn't just us sitting here in Cambridge telling people across the country, here's exactly how you deal with the problem that's in your local community, but we would be inviting teachers to share and principals and parents to share their stories, which we then in turn share through the site. Because I agree with the point that teachers should not be dealing with this in isolation. And as an education school, I think we should always be doing what we can to help educators, but now seems like a really opportune moment.
Thank you. Let's take 3 more questions.
This is Laura Koch, Think Equal. I'm going to go straight to the questions, no preamble, because I
Thank
could
you.
preamble for a whole 3 hours.
People behind you will be grateful.
Exactly. So we have several compulsory subjects like reading, counting, and writing. What about having a compulsory subject on social emotional learning? That is such an important element, and you cannot learn social emotional learning just freely. You need maybe 10,000 hours, like Malcolm Gladwell said. I would like to have your opinions on why is this not a priority in today's age, today's 21st century activities.
Thank you.
My name is George Fofana. I'm a fourth grade teacher here in Salem, Massachusetts, and I have sort of two short questions. My first one is, how can we get teachers to talk about diversity from within versus talking about it in a way that they're trying to diversify their students and not themselves? So the trouble that I'm having in my school is that I have a lot of, I'm a black male with an accent teaching in elementary school, and a lot of my colleagues grew up in a world that's not as diverse. So I have to constantly think about living in a diverse world, and I have to reevaluate my stance on everything, whereas they don't have to. So they're coming with the good intentions, but when the conversations get difficult, people tend to leave the conversations because they don't necessarily have to reevaluate their stance because they don't live in that world that they're compelled to be in a diverse setting. The second question is that when we have students from, I work in a school that we have students from Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, there's a lot of diverse learners and different cultural backgrounds. How do we teach those students? What kind of strategies do we use based on their cultural background? Because once we have the diverse setting, how is it that we can now facilitate these learners in that diverse setting?
Thank you. Let's get one last question for this round.
Okay. I'm Naomi Greenfield, and I work here at the HGSE. And my question is about sort of the difference between intervention programs and sort of proactive things that we're doing in the school. So, I think there were so many incidences and continue to be so many hate incidences in our schools. I know in my school district there are too, and so we tend to do these interventions in there, but since this is sort of the world we're living in, like how can we sort of approach the schools as these are proactive measures to prevent the interventions?
Thank you. Stephanie, you want to start with the direct question that was addressed to you at the beginning?
I think that the first question and the last question are very related to each other. So yes, I'm all for it. We should have a block that is devoted to SEL, and we should do that. I think.
So can I ask you why? Because I would have thought you would have said no. This should be infused in all the subjects.
I'm making a little bit of a joke.
Oh, okay. All right.
I think that we have that now. It's called health class, and it's marginalized and it's extra, and so I like the idea of elevating this area as a priority, and it would show that it's a priority because it has its own spot, right? It has time devoted to it in the block schedule. This is always the issue. How do you fit it in the block schedule that is already, everything adjacent to everything that is about basic skills or academic competencies? I actually think that the magic is in the idea of integration. Right. Integrating practices that build this domain of skills into counting, reading, writing. So we found in our intervention work that the best way to begin conversations, not dissimilar to your work, to begin conversations with kids about this stuff is to read high-quality children's literature, which is all about this. The reason it's all about this is because it's what kids want to talk about. And it's an opportunity to build sophisticated academic language about emotions or about relationships but that is reading, that is literacy. You can weave it into academics of all types, certainly social studies, history, but math, absolutely. So I think the challenge is to figure out how to make it explicit. We care, we teach this and it's valuable to us, but also implicit and hidden and inside all of these other domains. I think it's doable. There are lots of examples of it. So Quaker education is one very clear example of social emotional learning being invisible in the setting, but very obvious. So there's a curriculum there, but it's woven into the place. So, and I think that that's fundamentally preventative, right? That is a preventive approach. You bake it into the whole place as it lives and breathes. But that's the field of social emotional learning is struggling with this. What is integration? How do you do it? What does it look like? Because it's being retrofit, squeezed in rather than existing as part of from the ground up.
I think anyone that's ever had the flu can wish that you'd gotten a flu shot if you didn't. And I think we need to be able to deal with both people who have the acute flu and nonetheless give lots and lots of flu shots. I think it's always more effective if you can do the proactive work ahead of time. That's not always realistic. Sometimes you have to come in after the fact and intervene. But to use that larger sense of intervention, that is to say, how do we change the curriculum for students? I think that really I think we're probably all in agreement here that getting ahead of the phenomenon with, a sort of preventative, proactive. That's what we want to do.
I think the way to sell it is to sell it as promoting positive school climate.
Right.
We have a guide called Responding to Hate and Bias at School, which is divided into 3 portions. Before a crisis occurs, when a crisis occurs, and after the crisis. And we really want people to use it when there is no crisis. But in fact, when people turn to it, it's because they've had an incident, and that's what they have to do. But I'd like to respond to the issue about the diversity, because I think that really touches on a very common problem in schools, and one of the things that must make it very difficult to be a teacher of color in schools. Since 80% of the work of the teaching force is white, and another 80%, not the same 80%, are women. Being an African or a black male in elementary school is a very courageous thing to do. And it means that people are turning to you all the time, I imagine, to be the spokesperson and the mediator. And I do agree that it's the responsibility of all of us. I mean, this has to do with issues about whiteness, about recognizing that diversity is not just does not apply only to people of color. That we all have the responsibility to talk deeply about identity and about how it's formed, about the diversity that is hidden, and about our own experiences with living as in a very racialized society, which means our own experiences as those of us who are white as white people. And we have a responsibility to deal with that as well. But the other part of it is, and it gets to the question you asked about students, the basis of most culturally responsive pedagogy is the idea that you have to take the lead from the students in front of you. You have to know their stories, what strengths they and their families bring to the classroom, and build the curriculum to respond to those particular students, which may differ from semester to semester or year to year. We have found that, and of course, if you don't have diversity in your classroom, then how do you teach it? And part of the way is to, go to some kind of virtual contact. And we do that also. You mentioned rich children's literature, and we advise using texts that are both windows and mirrors, so that children see themselves in the curriculum, but they also have an opportunity to see others. And often by using text, you can expose the experiences that come with being different. So that was a lot of different thoughts in one answer. I hope that it was helpful.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else?
I'm fine.
So I know there are more of you who would have liked to ask questions, but one of the norms of this community is to respect the fact that people may have other things to do after certain events, and we said we would finish at 6:30. So I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists today, not only for very clear presentations on what is it that we should be helping students learn in schools in a diverse and rapidly changing world, but also for the sense of urgency that I hear in these presentations that I hope motivates each one of us to do what is within our reach to support our schools in helping all students learn what they must so that these values of freedom and equality can continue to thrive. Thank you all very much for coming.